Wait a minute, you. A beautiful doctor who looked familiar called out to me. But now wasn't the time for small talk. The pregnant woman comes first. At my words, she walked away with a look of regret on her face. The next day, things took a sudden turn. Alright, let's settle this. Our mystery-solving journey, which started from a trivial bet over 20 years ago, connected to someone's unimaginable thoughts. My name is Michael, a 38-year-old single, ordinary guy. I call myself ordinary because I believe there's nothing special about me. Just a typical person living a mundane life. That's me. I left Japan at 18 and went abroad alone. I wondered if living a normal life, going to high school, then college, then getting a job, would truly make me happy. I wasn't particularly good at studying. However, my father was a former military officer and my mother was Japanese, so I spoke both English and Japanese fluently. But since native English and the English taught in Japan are quite different, my test scores were just average, making me seem only somewhat good at English. Depending on the situation, my father had blonde hair and blue eyes, and my mother had black hair and black eyes. So I was born with dominant black hair and black eyes. I have a middle name, but I usually live as Michael, a typical Japanese person, surprising people when they find out I'm half. I had a dream of seeing the wider world, so I told my parents I was leaving Japan without taking the university entrance exams. I expected them to oppose the idea and prepared various excuses, but they saw me off without a word. Thus, I went abroad as soon as I graduated high school, and 20 years have passed since then. Now 38, I'm still single, without a girlfriend, and not even looking for one. No, maybe I couldn't make one. The shadow of a girl I spent my youth with still lingers in my mind. It's like a curse. I hadn't been able to visit home because of work, but now that things have settled down, I decided to return to my family home in a rural town in Japan. I hadn't told my parents about the trip to surprise them, and with a pounding heart, I boarded the plane. The hometown I returned to after so long had changed a lot in 20 years. I used to commute to high school in the neighboring town by train. And the nearest station I used daily during those 3 years looked completely different from my memory. The stand-up soba shop under the dim lights was gone, replaced by a famous donut shop. Next to it were 2 fast food restaurants, with lines of middle and high school students in casual clothes. Back when I was a student, there were no such places, and we used to chat on the couches in a small shopping mall. Things have changed a lot with time. A little further, there was a souvenir shop, a convenience store, and a trendy cafe where students chatted and studied. It felt like I had wandered into another world. This was no longer the hometown I knew. As I walked towards the taxi stand with my suitcase, a large building I didn't recognize came into view. At the same time, the taxi driver I had booked got out, loaded my luggage into the trunk, and started chatting with me. "Hey there, are you visiting family?" "Oh, yes. I've been away for over 20 years. "In that case, you must be surprised by how much this town has developed. This is a condo, the first high-rise in this town. It was fully booked in no time. Apparently, the same company is building similar high-rises elsewhere, and they are already receiving inquiries. Moreover, the first floor has a 24-hour gym with a cafe, and above it, there are cram schools and tutoring centers. The cram school I attended in middle school is now in one of these high-rises, not in an old, shabby building. As I rode in the taxi, looking out the window, I saw more buildings that seemed out of place in this rural town. I passed by my old elementary and middle schools. The once dilapidated buildings were now completely renovated and shiny, with no trace of the past. While the town's development and population growth were good signs, it also felt a bit sad. It would take about 30 minutes by car to get to my parents' house. Since it was lunchtime and the main roads were crowded, I asked the driver to take a back road. On the way, while waiting at a red light and looking out the window, I noticed a woman. She was crouching and appeared to be in pain, which I thought was clearly an emergency situation. "Excuse me, that woman over there, she looks unwell." The taxi driver noticed too and quickly pulled over. I rushed out of the taxi to help the woman. I saw the maternity mark on her bag. A pregnant woman in distress was clearly a serious situation, so I immediately thought of calling an ambulance. Given the traffic on the main road, it might take a while. "Are you okay? Where's your doctor?" The taxi driver, who had also gotten out, asked the woman. She replied in a faint voice that her clinic was just ahead. In that case, it's faster to take her in the taxi than wait for an ambulance. We decided to rush her to the obstetrician 500 meters away. The woman was already in labor, but luckily the taxi was equipped as a maternity taxi, with clean towels and other supplies. We managed the situation while I contacted the hospital. They said they would prepare for delivery, and I followed their instructions. As soon as we arrived, the woman was taken on a stretcher to the delivery room. At that moment, a beautiful doctor, who seemed to be in charge, glanced at me and said, "Wait a minute, are you," with a puzzled look. I ignored her and said, "Just take care of the mother and baby." Then, the female doctor suddenly came to her senses and simply said, "I'm sorry," before disappearing into the delivery room just like before. Within 15 minutes, we heard the baby's first cry, and the taxi driver and I both breathed a sigh of relief. I didn't know the pregnant woman. I couldn't stay there any longer, so I decided to leave. 10 minutes later, I arrived at my parents' house. When I went to pay the taxi fare, it was surprisingly cheap. When I asked why, the driver explained. "I stopped the meter while we helped the pregnant woman. So, you don't need to pay for that part." I thought for a moment and said, "All right," handing him a $100 bill. When he tried to give me change, I said, "Consider it a tip for guiding me around the changed town and for quickly helping the pregnant woman." I got out of the taxi as he kept bowing his head in gratitude. After ensuring the taxi left, I rang the doorbell of my house. After a moment, my mother, who had aged but still bore traces of her younger self, appeared. She froze for a moment, eyes wide, then laughed heartily and welcomed me. "You've grown so tall. You surprised me by coming suddenly. Come on in." In the living room, my father was watching something on his smartphone. Curious about what he was watching so intently, my mother came over and whispered in my ear, "Your father's been hooked on this masked band. You know, he's American, so he loves this kind of thing. He's always saying, 'When are they coming to Japan?'" After hearing this, I turned my attention back to my father. Then he started talking without even greeting me. I feel the soul in the music of these four. The bass that controls the deep tones, the guitar that truly enjoys the music, the drums that hold it all together, and the vocalist whose soul comes through even through the screen. Everything about them is cool and amazing. After chatting with my parents for a while, I went back to my room. The room where I spent my childhood through high school was just as it had been, as if it had been frozen in time. I ran my finger along the window and desk, but not a speck of dust came off. Imagining how my mother must have cared for this room filled me with warmth. Then, we had dinner together, enjoyed family time, and I took a long soak in the bath. Having lived abroad for so long, it felt soothing to experience the unique Japanese culture of soaking in a hot bath again. I slept in a warm bed, and the next morning, I was awakened by the sound of my parents arguing with someone. Right now, I'm wearing a sweatsuit. Thinking it would be inappropriate to go out like this, I quickly changed and went downstairs. At the entrance, my parents were arguing with an unfamiliar middle-aged man. When he saw me, his eyes widened in anger and he shouted, "Is it you? You scoundrel! How dare you deceive my daughter? I won't forgive you. You'll take responsibility for this. Please calm down. I can't believe our son would do such a thing. Besides, he only returned 2 days ago." My mother tried to intervene, but the man, in his rage, wouldn't listen. Honestly, I had no idea what he was talking about. From his words, I gathered he thought I had caused some trouble with a woman. However, I hadn't been in contact with any women. The only female contact in my personal phone was my mother. Wondering what this could be about, I realized that the man was the father of the pregnant woman I had taken to the hospital yesterday. He had somehow mistaken me for his daughter's ex-boyfriend and came here in a rage. It made sense that my mother denied it without needing to hear from me. After all, I had just returned to Japan yesterday. I didn't think the hospital would have violated confidentiality and given out my information. But I did recall one thing. When I took her to the hospital yesterday, she insisted on thanking me and asked for my contact information. My contact information? No, I didn't do anything worth being thanked for. Helping someone in need is just the right thing to do. Even though I declined, when she insisted, I couldn't argue any further. So, I only told her that I live nearby. I didn't think that alone would identify me, but apparently, the father had overheard nurses talking about me at the hospital. The man who brought Emily here left without saying anything. Really? Could he be the baby's father? Emily's unmarried, right? Yes, that's what I heard. The midwife tried to find out during counseling, but she didn't say. But since it's her decision, the hospital can't intervene. The father somehow concluded that her ex had abandoned her after she got pregnant, only to reappear and then disappear after bringing her to the hospital. I don't think most people would jump to such conclusions, but he must have panicked after suddenly finding out he had a grandchild. If I had a daughter who suddenly said I had a baby but there is no father, I'd probably freak out too. Naturally, he questioned his daughter. But she didn't tell him anything. Therefore, thinking that probing further wouldn't get him any answers, he casually said, "It seems a kind person brought you here to get some information from his daughter." She laughed and talked about me, mentioning that I live around here and that I look like I might be of mixed race. From that description, he guessed it was us. Given that my father was a former military man and my mother loved to chat, our family stood out. And that's why he came storming in today. This misunderstanding was getting out of hand, and my mother was considering calling the police. I explained that I didn't know the woman, and yesterday was the first time we met. I just returned from overseas yesterday, so really, I don't want to hear excuses. Emily is my precious daughter, and how did it come to this? It seemed the daughter's name was Emily. Emily's father's anger didn't subside, and the argument only heated up, getting us nowhere. We can't resolve this ourselves. Emily is still in the hospital after giving birth. And we shouldn't burden her now. Maybe we should consult the police. At that moment, a third party spoke up. This man is not your daughter's ex-boyfriend. Everyone turned their gaze to the person standing behind Emily's father. It was the beautiful obstetrician who had wanted to say something to me yesterday. He really just happened to help Emily, who went into labor on the street, and brought her to the hospital by taxi. If your daughter finds out about this misunderstanding, it will surely upset her. I understand your concern, but please calm down. But, Dr. Smith, I can vouch for him, he is not a bad person. Even with her reassurance, Emily's father still seemed unconvinced. However, he couldn't argue against the words of his daughter's doctor and ended up glaring at me instead. Then, my usually quiet father suddenly spoke up. I didn't raise my son to mistreat someone else's daughter. I swear to God. My son is not that kind of man, and if he were, I would straighten him out myself. Though in his late 60s, my father's presence was still imposing, given his military background. Even I, his son, was left speechless and held my breath. Emily's father finally grasped the situation and apologized, admitting he was wrong to make assumptions without any evidence. My mother looked at me. Surely, she wants me to decide what to do with this person. I sighed and said, "Misunderstandings happen. Please try to stay calm and think things through next time." Then, Emily's father, his face turning bright red, said, "I'm sorry," and walked away. Dr. Smith then asked if I was really okay with forgiving him. My parents seemed to share her concern, but I shrugged and replied, "When I was younger, I clashed with many people due to misunderstandings and faced numerous setbacks. I'm sure he loves his daughter more than anything. Otherwise, he wouldn't have acted so boldly, right?" My father sighed softly and said, "You're right. If that's how you feel, then I won't say anything more. Honey, is that okay with you?" And returned to the living room sofa. My mother then looked at the doctor and made a surprised sound. Wondering what was going on, I watched as my mother hesitantly asked, "Are you Sarah?" The doctor, now identified as Sarah, smiled warmly and replied, "It's been a long time, ma'am." My mother's tense expression instantly transformed into one of joy. Smiling cheerfully, she started a rapid-fire conversation with the female doctor called Sarah. "Oh my goodness, it is you, Sarah. When did you come back? You've become so beautiful. Why didn't you tell us sooner?" My mother, known for her talkativeness, showed no signs of stopping, so I intervened and asked her to bring us some tea. Hearing the name Sarah, I also remembered. "Are you Sarah Smith, who sat next to me for 3 years in high school?" Then the female doctor, or rather Sarah, nodded. Then she said something unexpected. "Emily's father being here was a coincidence. I came for a different reason. We still haven't settled our old bet. I came to finalize it." I pondered what she meant, and then a memory surfaced. It was right after we started high school. Sarah had said something out of the blue that day. "Hey, let's see who can get a perfect score on Mrs. Johnson's test first. And let's compete on all our test scores." Mrs. Johnson was our English teacher, known for her incredibly tough tests. Even I often found myself saying, despite being fairly good at English. Even Sarah, who was fluent in everyday conversations, had only managed to score a maximum of 98 points. This competition continued into our senior year, but I decided to go abroad, so I started slacking on my studies. I didn't plan on going to college, so I barely studied and skipped the last test of the second term due to a cold. Not even bothering with the makeup exam. It seemed that was what she was referring to. "We might have had a winner in that last test, but you did nothing." "Yeah, so you won by default, Sarah." "What? How can I be satisfied with that?" Before I could ask what she meant, Sarah handed me a test paper and an answer sheet. Confused, I looked at her, and she replied with a confident smile. I kept the last test and printed it out from my computer. Sarah seemed fully determined. It was clear she wouldn't leave unless I accepted the challenge, so I reluctantly agreed. As I glanced at the test, I thought. Back then, I found these tests difficult, but now I could solve them with ease. When I was younger, I only knew English because my father spoke it, without any real experience abroad. However, having spent the past 20 years overseas, this test felt like elementary school level to me. But then I got stuck on the last question. Noticing my hesitation, Sarah laughed and said, "I got stuck on that one too." It made me go and I ended up with 99 points. If I'd gotten it right, I would have had 100. Despite thinking it over, I couldn't find the answer and ended up guessing. After grading the test, I scored the same 99 points as Sarah. So it's a tie. We never settled the score after all. As she said that, I noticed her phone vibrating in her pocket. It seemed the hospital was calling, and after enjoying the tea and snacks my mother had prepared, Sarah left. My mother watched her go with a look of regret. Thinking she might know something about Sarah, I asked. Apparently, after graduating high school, Sarah went to a top medical university in Japan. Her father had originally run the hospital, and my mother, who usually saw a family doctor in a neighboring town, hadn't realized Sarah had taken over. Sarah took over her father's hospital and is now the director. I was surprised to hear that from the neighbors. She came back just a week ago. I was amazed at how my mother, with her wide social circle, had already gathered so much information within an hour. But more than that, I was struck by Sarah. She had indeed become a doctor. Since she had top grades, it wasn't surprising, but it made me reflect on our different paths. Yet, something still bothered me. That question. Even if this is the correct answer, it doesn't sit right with me. Why did Mrs. Johnson consider this correct? My mother tilted her head in confusion. Despite pondering it, I couldn't find the truth. Realizing it was futile to think about it further, I pushed it out of my mind. The following days passed uneventfully until 2 days before my return abroad. In the evening, we had a visitor, and when I answered the door, there stood Emily, holding her baby. "Thank you for your help the other day. My father also caused a lot of trouble, and I'm terribly sorry." Behind her stood her father, looking uncomfortable. "It's okay, I don't care about it." When I said that, both Emily and her father looked relieved. They had brought cakes from a famous local bakery as a thank you. Not wanting to be rude by refusing, I accepted the cakes, and they bowed repeatedly before leaving. When I told my mother about this, she happily poured tea and transferred the cakes onto plates. My parents had a sweet tooth. Since we received the cakes as an apology, we decided to enjoy them. The rich cream and the tartness of the strawberries created a delightful taste that made me smile. As my father, who loved sweets, ate his cake, he suddenly became talkative. I can feel the soul in this cake. It's truly delicious. At that moment, I had a realization and rushed upstairs to my room. I read the last question I had missed once more. Why did Kathy cry here? The final question of the long passage was straightforward, and the answer should have been option 2. Sarah had also naturally chosen it and ended up being wrong. It seemed like something that could be guessed, but the answer required a reason, and no one had gotten it right. I decided to read the English text again, carefully and thoroughly, immersing myself in the emotions of the characters. As I did, I suddenly realized the answer and found myself running. I headed to Sarah's hospital. She might be busy with deliveries, so I wasn't sure if I could see her, but fortunately, she was taking a break and drinking coffee in the courtyard. Seeing me out of breath, Sarah widened her eyes. "What's wrong? Why are you in such a hurry?" I figured out the answer to that question. Sarah leaned forward in surprise. "No way. Mrs. Johnson only gave us the answer, not the reason." I slowly began explaining the strange question. The story itself was ordinary, and the other questions were solvable with normal thinking. But I remembered something. If you read carefully, you could see that Kathy was modeled after a famous person. This person was known for saying, "There are no solutions in life. There is only the forward motion. Solutions come afterward." So, from the preceding sentences, I deduced. Why did Kathy cry? Was it because she was sad about parting with her fiancé? Was it sadness that brought tears? No. What if she was modeled after this famous person? Sarah seemed to realize something too, and muttered, "No way." Then a nurse called out to Sarah. A woman was rapidly progressing in labor, and Sarah needed to go immediately. "Let's meet at that place and check the answer." With that, Sarah flashed a radiant smile like the sun and said, "This time, we'll settle the score," before running off. The morning of my flight arrived. The flight was in the evening, so I planned to leave town after lunch. Sarah showed up at the agreed place. She had arranged for another OB/GYN to cover for her and had the morning free. I visited the home of our former mentor, Mrs. Johnson, with Sarah, who had her phone in her hand saying that she would return immediately if anything unexpected happened. However, the nameplate on the door in front of me says Kenneth. Both Sarah and I knew where Mrs. Johnson lived because we had been under her care. When we rang the doorbell and saw the person who answered, we were shocked. It wasn't Mrs. Johnson who came out, but Emily, the pregnant woman from before. Emily, who had been surprised to see us, quickly understood when we mentioned Mrs. Johnson, and she invited us into the living room. It turned out Mrs. Johnson had dementia and was now living in a care facility. Emily was her granddaughter. "Grandma has forgotten about me and Dad. She's even forgotten that she changed her last name when she got married. I heard some things about you too." As I was wondering what was going on, Emily took out a letter and said, "I have 2 unforgettable students. They secretly competed to see who could score 100 on my test first." This letter starts with those words. Sarah and I realized she was talking about us and held our breath. Emily continued reading slowly. This question was almost made for the 2 of them. So, there is no answer. That is the answer. I believe Michael and Sarah will find the truth and come here. This is where the letter ends. Emily handed us the letter. After a moment of silence, Sarah spoke up. Kathy didn't cry out of sadness. She cried out of anger at herself for not having a solution, and then out of hope because she knew she had to move forward. The answer didn't exist in the choices. Not existing was the answer. I nodded in agreement, having reached the same conclusion. We thanked Emily and left her house, talking as we walked to the station. "How did you realize the trick?" I didn't understand at first either, but my father's use of the word soul made everything click. Reading the text, I always felt there was something off about it. The story seemed to be guiding us towards something, structured in a way that made it unsettling for someone proficient in English. I realized that Mrs. Johnson wanted us to see the soul that resided in this girl. She was modeled after a famous person, and from his famous quote, I derived the answer. It's very like Mrs. Johnson. She always loved French authors. And this famous person was also a French writer. Sarah nodded slowly, then looked puzzled. By the way, Your father always talked about soul and spirit, didn't he? Yeah, he's a romantic. I guess I inherited that from him. Then I realized another trick. Soul, that's it. My father, despite being a former military man, had wide connections, including French authors. And I knew he had a private friendship with Mrs. Johnson. This connection was how I knew Mrs. Johnson's house. And my father was the only person who knew about my other side. Maybe my father had talked to Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson knew about my dreams, that's why she created such a question. No, it makes sense. She probably knew my heart better than I did. I finally felt like the dots that had puzzled me were connecting. I am currently an artist traveling around the world. When I left for overseas, I confided in my father that I wanted to be a musician who plays with soul. I'm sure Mrs. Johnson knew about this through her friendship with my father. She wanted to convey his feelings to me through the test. She wanted to encourage me, in two senses. There is only the force to move forward. Solutions come afterward. Kathy wasn't modeled after a famous person but after me. I recalled how Mrs. Johnson, always silent and inscrutable, cared deeply for me and Sarah. I was muttering something to myself, and Sarah looked confused, but we had arrived at the station. Hey, I don't understand. What do you mean by your heart and that Kathy was modeled after you? What are you talking about? I laughed and answered Sarah. I think we'll meet again in 6 months. I'll explain then. I pointed to her phone vibrating in her pocket. Is it an emergency? Good luck. She hurriedly answered the call, and I waved with a smile as I boarded the train. 6 months later, I returned to Japan as promised and visited Sarah. In front of her, eager for the answer, I knelt and presented a small box. I chose the path of an artist, but I could never forget you. Even when I went abroad, your face kept appearing in my mind, and it still does. I didn't recognize you at first because you had become so beautiful. How can we fulfill both our dreams? Do we have to give one up? No. Solutions will come afterward. Sarah, will you date me with marriage in mind? Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she took the silver ring, her face crinkling into a smile. Do you mean you found a way to achieve both dreams? Choosing between your dream and being with me? Really? Both Mrs. Johnson and you are so roundabout. Yes, I will. Mrs. Johnson must have known I had feelings for Sarah. Like my father, a romantic, she encouraged me through the English test. Though she couldn't intervene directly, she wanted to help his troubled students. That was the kind of person Mrs. Johnson was. After my public proposal, we received applause and cheers from those around us. A year later, we were married and spent the last day before moving into our new home at my parents' house. My father, unusually drunk, needed help to his bedroom, so my mother and I assisted him. When we entered his room, I was stunned. These are photos of the masked artist, all of the vocalist. Did Dad like them that much? My mother laughed gracefully. Your father has always loved soul music. He says he feels a close connection to the soul in those lyrics. As we laid my father in bed, he murmured softly, I love that vocalist more than anyone in the world. After all, he's my pride and joy. Tears welled up, and my mother gently patted my back. 2 years later, Sarah has returned to work after giving birth, and our days have been busy. So, are you done with your artist activities? Yeah, I am. I kept hiding my face because I didn't know who I was. But I don't need to do that anymore. The vocalist of that band has to be someone who doesn't know who they are. The members told me I'm obsolete now. Sarah laughed and continued. Well, they all seem to wish you happiness. Even the first song with the new vocalist seemed to be dedicated to you. Listening to that song, I thought those guys had done something really thoughtful. Then I remembered Emily. The new vocalist who joined the masked band I used to be part of is Japanese. Watching him on screen, Emily had tears in her eyes. The girl Kathy and the problem Mrs. Johnson made. She too saw off her fiancé who left to pursue his dreams. And Kathy chose to live strong. Emily is probably the same. Without revealing who the father is, she became a wonderful mother, raising her child with her family. Everyone has one or two secrets. I hoped that happiness would come to Emily and the new vocalist. Oh, let's go visit Mrs. Johnson sometime and tell him our news. That's a great idea. She might not remember us, but we'll be just like old friends having tea. As we chatted about such trivial things, I savored the happiness I had finally grasped with my own hands.